Hey guys, Naz here with the last part of the Making of Suicune series. Today we're going to be going over how to mould, cast and attach a resin horn like the one I made for Suicune. This will be using a two-part mould and some clear resin. For making the mould we're going to be using NSP, which is a sulfur-free clay. It never hardens, so it's perfect for use in making moulds, and it doesn't have anything inside it that is going to inhibit the curing process. I've already gone and sculpted my horn out of Super Sculpey, so I won't be showing you guys how I do that, but I will be showing you how I make the mould, because sculpting the horn is pretty simple. So what I'm doing here is I've sketched out a rectangle in the rough dimensions I want the mould to be, considering how big I think it's going to need to be to encase the horn. And I'm just putting down a thin layer of the plastiline clay. This is heat reactive clay, so you can melt it to a degree. You'll see it a fair few times. I will be using a blow dryer to warm it up. And I'm pretty much cheating, starting off the lower part of my mould by embedding it into this bottom layer of clay. And you want your horn to be raised off the ground a bit, because this space underneath it is what is going to be the opposite side of our mould. So I've warmed this clay up quite significantly, and I'm just making a little area for the horn to sit. Now I'm going to proceed to neaten up this lower side of the mould. This side of the mould is going to be the side that we will pour second, but it is also going to give us the base to pour our top half of our mould on. So you can see here that I'm just getting little bits of clay at a time, and I'm filling up, I'm making sort of a wall around our horn, and I want it to come up about halfway. You can draw the halfway point with a little marker, but I wasn't being extremely careful with exactly going halfway up the horn. It doesn't really matter as long as it's approximate. So I'm warming up the clay, and I'm using a bunch of tools just to press it right against the edge of that horn. You want to get it as smooth as possible and as neat as possible, because this is going to really influence the neatness of how your mould fits together. So once we've gone ahead and we've pretty much filled up half of our mould with clay, we're going to take, I just got a little old paintbrush and I got some rubbing alcohol, and I'm going to smooth out the clay that we already have laid down, just so that it's nice and even, there's no rough parts, and it's nice and smooth against our horn. So after doing this, the next part is we're going to be adding some registration marks, and these are parts of the mould that are going to grip together, kind of like teeth. So I'm just using the end of a paintbrush and just doing a bunch of semi-deep little dots, and you'll also see that I do a little wiggly line. This is just so that when our mould pieces are taken apart, when we put them back together, they're going to sit nice and tight and lock in at these key points. So here I am not so carefully using a Stanley knife to remove excess parts of the clay, because silicone is extremely expensive, especially here in Australia. I want to make the mould relatively close to the horn and not be going too excessively. The only part that I did take too much off of was up the top here, near the tip of the horn. You want to try and keep 1/2 to 1 inch of a wall around the outside of your mould. Next up, I'm going to be building the walls of the mould, so I'm just using some little wooden board that I found at the hobby store and hot glue, and I'm really making sure to seal up all of those edges around the mould, making sure that no silicone is going to be leaking out anywhere. Probably went a bit excessive with the hot glue, but since this was my first time, I just really wanted to make sure that nothing was going to leak and cause any problems. So now you can see what the walls look like, and they're all glued and dried up. So now we're going to pour the first half of our mould. I'm using a 2-part silicone called Pinky Saw, which is readily available here in Australia. So you just mix the 2 parts by weight, and I'm using a paintbrush to brush it onto the first layer, and using some tinned air to get rid of any bubbles. You want your first layer to come out as neatly as possible, because this is going to be what the resin comes in contact with when you pour it. So it needs to be as neat and bubble free as possible. The rest of the layers, certainly you want as bubble free as possible, but they're not as important. So you can see that I'm pouring in a thin stream from up high, and this is just to try and reduce the amount of bubbles that are going into this mould. The next day, once that's all cured, I flip it over and I start to remove the clay from underneath the horn. So this is the opposite side to what we were looking at before. I found this really looks satisfying on video, sort of peeling away all the clay, and you can see how the silicone has captured the reverse image of that clay and horn that we put down there in the first place. This took quite a while to rip up all of that clay, but you want to do it as neatly as possible, trying not to rip the mould with any of your tools. I actually cut myself with one of the tools, being a bit too enthusiastic, ripping the clay out, so definitely be careful. Here I'm using some rubbing alcohol and just some cotton buds to really wash that mould clean. You want to get rid of as much clay as physically possible because any left behind is going to sort of make a little unwanted cavity into your mould. So once that's nice and clean, I didn't show here, but I took the mould outside with a respirator and I sprayed it with some mould release. And you'll definitely be able to find mould release. Just go to your local moulding store and they will recommend what you need to use in your country. You can see here that I'm pouring now the opposite side of the mould, and this won't stick to the silicone because I've added those layers of mould release. So you can see that I've measured by weight, and now I'm going to repeat the exact same process that we did for the other side, but with this side of the mould. If you find that you have any streaks that weren't mixed through, you can sort of mix them inside the mould while the silicone isn't set yet. Because I'm not very strong, I get my boyfriend to break the walls off because I've used so much hot glue. They are quite strong, so he's just ripping off all that excess wood here and revealing our moulds. So now that we have both of our mould sides released, I clean them off a bit with soap and water, and now I'm taking them to my Dremel press and I'm just putting some tiny little drill holes through the top side of the mould that is going to be facing upwards when we pour it. I'm just putting some little holes in the extremities so it gives somewhere for the air to be pushed up rather than creating large air bubbles. Here I'm using about 100 million elastic bands to keep our mould nice and tight together. I've cut a little hole where I'm going to be injecting the resin. Today I'll be using liquid diamonds, which is a type of resin that I found online. It's usually made for jewellery making, but is extremely clear and results in very few bubbles even if you don't use a pressure pot. I did start with this powdered pigment. I have proceeded to buy liquid pigment because the powdered pigment does seem to leave a bit of residue and is not a perfectly even colour, but it's just what I had at the time. So I'm mixing the resin according to the directions by weight. I just have a tiny little gram scale that I got off eBay, mixing it with some paddle pop sticks, and then I'll proceed to add my pigment. So it's kind of like a gel in this state. I'm just adding a little bit in, mixing it up until it's dissolved, and then I'll proceed to add as much glitter as I feel necessary. You absolutely don't have to add glitter. I just really liked how it looked for this particular project. I thought it gives a kind of mystical gem-like appearance. So I added both these large flakes and these small powder glitters. I got both of them off Etsy from a private maker. You can message me if you want to find them. But they're just really gorgeous. They give sort of this magical crystal look, as I mentioned before. So you can see here what the resin looks like. And now I'm getting a large animal syringe that I got from my local vet surgery. They were quite happy to sell me these once I explained what I was using them for. And I just like using these because it keeps it's just an easy way to inject or funnel the resin into your mould. So I've injected a bit in and I'm swirling it all around, trying to get it to every extremity, and I filled it until the resin poured out of the top. Here I'm just setting up our pressure pot, and this is used to cast crystal clear resin. What you do is you bring it up to, you put your mould and resin inside, and then you bring it up to approximately 60 psi, and it keeps it like that, ideally until the resin has set. This crushes any bubbles inside your mould, inside your resin. The first time that I poured this, unfortunately I put too little resin in. I wasn't forceful enough with really filling that mould. So the next time I tried really hard to inject as much resin as possible, and you can see that I got a much better result the second time. It can definitely take some trial and error working out exactly how much resin you need to inject and any quirks that your mould might have. You can see there's sort of a rim around the casting, and this is the seam line where our two mould pieces fit together. The excess is called flashing, and we need to remove it. So I just got some fine grit sandpaper and just sand it all around till you can see that there really is no seam line visible. Now I need to get this horn to fit onto Suicune's head nice and snug. So what I'm doing is I'm taking my Dremel and just using a little sanding bit, I am making sort of a concave shape underneath the horn so that it really draws it underneath and against Suicune's front head. I took this over to Suicune multiple times just to see how it was fitting and to see if I needed to take away any more material from underneath the horn. At this stage I also shortened the front of the horn and just made any cosmetic changes. Now we're going to work on we're going to attach this to Suicune. So I've marked with some silver Sharpie where I want a row of wire to go, and I'm taking it over to my Dremel router and I'm just routing out a little channel underneath the horn. You can see that this fits really nicely on Suicune's head, and now we're going to attach the wire which is going to attach into Suicune. So it fits nicely in this little channel, and what I've got here is some 5-minute epoxy adhesive, and this has resin inside it to allow it to really bond together. It's incredibly strong. This is probably the strongest glue out there as far as craft purposes. You get it from the hardware store, and all you do is mix part A and part B in equal parts, and I just used a little paddle pop stick to transfer that glue into that little channel that I'd made, making sure that it covers the wire entirely. Once I filled in that channel, I believe I let it set for at least a couple of hours. It says that it dries in 5 minutes, but I just wanted to make sure that it was extremely well bonded and that wire definitely wasn't going anywhere. It's pretty much like encasing it in another layer of resin, and it definitely wasn't going to lift off. So now we're coming to attach it to Suicune. I've finished all the sewing underneath where the horn is going to go, and now I'm just using pins to mark where the wire is going to pierce through her head from the back of the horn. I'm just making a couple of tiny incisions, and I'm going to trim my wire a little bit to the desired length, and I'm going to poke it through her head and into her body. I will also turn the edges of the wire around on the edge so that there are no sharp bits, and you can see I'm just bending it back and poking it into the holes that I've made. You can see that this sits quite snugly, and now I'm really just going to use some hot glue, and I'm going to glue underneath the horn and then press it against Suicune's skull. And this held extremely well along with the wire. So the wire is your main source of holding, but the glue just keeps it nice and tight against the plush. And I found this to be extremely strong. I had a go at trying to rip it off, and it was impossible. I would have ripped the minky off before the horn came off. So you can see here, this is our finished horn on Suicune. I really love how the effect came out, super sparkly, super pretty, and I could potentially use this mould for many more castings. This was my first time making a 2-part mould, but I hope you found it helpful. I would definitely suggest watching a bunch of other mould making videos on the internet before you attempt your own, but I definitely think it's something awesome to learn when you want to make a plush that specifically might have some horns or crystal elements. It really takes it to a different level, and people certainly loved how this horn turned out. So guys, that's the end of my Suicune making of series. I hope you found it really helpful. I hope you learned a bunch of things. I will be making more series in the future. If you see a plush that I'm making and you'd like me to cover elements of making it or make a series on it, definitely let me know if you're interested. But anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!